Before dawn on the edge of the Pine Barrens, Eli Carter, a homeless 12-year-old, freezes behind a thicket as two men drag an unconscious stranger toward a freshly dug pit. When the fog thins, Eli recognizes the face. Silas Rourke, the boss people in town only whisper about. One man chuckles, "Hurry. His people won't get here in time." Eli's blood turns cold because that only makes sense if someone had compromised the rescue from the inside. A shovel hits wet earth thump, thump, like a countdown. Silas twitches. Steel gray eyes crack open and lock onto Eli's hiding place, half command, half plea. "Don't let me die here. No phone. No adults. Just a stone by a pine and a choice." Eli throws the stone. The men spin around. He lunges, drags Silas back from the edge, and runs. Minutes later, he stumbles onto the road, waving down cars that blaze past until a dark SUV brakes hard. The window drops. The driver's stare isn't panicked. It's controlled. Eli gasps. They're burying Silas Rourke alive. And the driver's expression shifts like he's just realized the hunt has begun. Do you feel how tense this opening is? Give us a like, please. Share it with anyone who lives for breath stealing plot twists. And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. Miles Keene didn't need to ask another question to know this wasn't the prank of a panicked child. The instant the window slid down, he'd already seen the signs an ordinary person would miss. Wet mud clinging from Eli's pant cuffs all the way to his knees. A thin scrape on his wrist, like he'd just been dragged across bark. And that very particular look street kids carry, scared and stubborn at the same time. As if he wasn't believed right now, he'd sprint straight into death on his own. Eli hadn't even caught his breath before he started stammering and pointing into the fog. And Miles reached for the seatbelt. Not rough, but decisive, like an order that didn't need words. "Sit still. Point the way." He didn't ask why the boy was there. He didn't ask whether he was telling the truth. He just did what he always did when Silas slipped beyond his control. He pressed a concealed button beneath the dashboard. The vehicle screen made no sound, but a small icon lit up, signaling that a silent communication channel was open. No ringing, no call, only short, encrypted pulses that an outsider would mistake for a car running normally. Miles turned the wheel. The SUV left the empty road, rolled over gravel, and pushed into a dark trail like the mouth of a cave, where the headlights were shattered by pine branches into pale, broken pieces of light. Eli held his breath, pointing again and again, left, right, as if he were running the route he'd just run on exhausted legs. Miles listened to everything with his ears, and read everything with his eyes. The forest air smelled like freshly turned earth. That damp, heavy smell anyone who's ever dug a hole never confuses. He eased off the gas at the right moment so the tires wouldn't squeal, so the dry leaves wouldn't crack too loudly beneath the wheels. At a bend, Eli suddenly lurched forward, his voice breaking with fear. There. Miles switched off the headlights, leaving only a dim strip of light, just enough to see the ground. Then opened the door and stepped out like a shadow. He signaled Eli to stay put in the SUV. Eli tried to argue, but Miles's look made him swallow the words. It wasn't a vicious look. It was the look of someone who'd lived long enough to understand that sometimes life is only one extra step away from death. Miles moved along the direction Eli had indicated, counting his own breaths to keep himself steady, and then he saw Silas. There was no dramatic spectacle, just a heavy body lying on its side at the edge of a pit. A dark coat, soaked with mud. A hand still marked by rope. Miles dropped to his knees, set 2 fingers on Silas's wrist. A pulse. Very faint, but there. He didn't let his face change, because he knew if Eli saw panic, the boy would break. He spoke in clipped, clean sentences. "Good. You did the right thing." Then he worked like a machine trained for this his whole life. A quick assessment, cutting the bindings, dragging Silas back from the crumbling edge just far enough to be safe. No yanking, no sudden shock to a body that had already been pushed too far. On Silas's wrist, the luxury watch was still there. But what made Miles's spine go cold was something else. The concealed tracking device he'd once attached to Silas with his own hands was gone. Not smashed, not dropped during a struggle. It had been removed cleanly, correctly, at the right point, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Miles didn't say it out loud, but inside his head, a door slammed shut. This wasn't a random ambush anymore. This was a planned clearing of the path, and whoever did the clearing had the authority to touch what no one was allowed to touch. An insider. Just one word. And it was enough to turn the entire Rourke security system into a joke if it was handled wrong. Miles lifted a hand to his ear, brushing the invisible earpiece, and sent a short signal through the silent channel. No names, no location, only a coded command. Bring the medical team, but don't turn on the sirens. Lock down the routes, but don't create chaos. And most of all, no one was to know where Silas was except the people Miles chose. Eli climbed out of the SUV, legs shaking, but he forced his spine straight, as if he was afraid of being thrown out. He looked at Silas, then at Miles, his lips pressed tight. Is he going to live? Miles didn't promise what he couldn't be sure of, but he also wouldn't let the boy sink into darkness. If you hadn't thrown that rock, he wouldn't have had a chance. You pulled him back. Eli let out a breath like he'd finally released a stone lodged in his throat. Right then, a gust swept through, pushing the fog aside, and Miles saw what made the hair rise along his neck. At the very edge of the dim light, on the wet earth beside a pine stump, there was a third shoe print. Fresh, sharp, new. It didn't belong to Eli. It didn't belong to the two men Eli described as the ones who dug the pit. Because the tread grooves were completely different. That print pointed toward the pit, as if someone had stood there watching for a long time, then turned away lightly, unhurried, not panicked. Miles lifted his head on instinct, eyes cutting through the black between the trunks. No one, only the forest and the silence. But he knew this feeling, the feeling of being watched from somewhere he couldn't see. He crouched, pressed his palm to the shoe print for a brief moment, as if he could memorize its shape into his skin, then rose and covered Eli with his body by reflex. When the sound of distant vehicles began to drift closer, Miles didn't relax at all. He only stared into the darkness ahead and thought one thing. The third person had been here. That person knew Silas was still alive. And if Miles had been one beat slower, the hunt that had begun out on the road might have begun right here in the woods. The steel gate slid aside without a squeal, only a faint tremor traveling through the pavement, as if this entire place had been built to swallow sound whole. Miles drove through the narrow entrance, the headlights long since off, relying only on the dim glow of recessed guidance lights, just enough to keep the tires from biting into loose stone. Eli sat curled up in the back seat, knees drawn tight. The coat he'd borrowed from Miles, still carrying the smell of forest wind. His hands kept tightening, then releasing, as if he needed the motion to remind himself he was still alive. Silas lay in front, head slightly tilted, his face cut out of the darkness by the dashboard light, still cold as stone even though his breathing had steadied. Miles didn't say another word. He just kept both hands on the wheel as if he were holding the whole world from falling. When the SUV stopped inside a sealed garage, the automatic door closed the moment the rear of the vehicle cleared it. And Eli felt as if he'd just been shut inside a box with no way out. Then the door into the house swung open, and Harper Lane Rourke stepped out, not running, not panicking, only moving straight ahead like someone who'd been standing there a long time and was simply waiting for the exact second to arrive. She wore a plain black coat, her hair tied back neatly, her face free of heavy makeup. Yet her eyes were so sharp that Eli felt his heart draw tight. Harper didn't rush in to wrap her arms around Silas. She didn't break into sobs. She didn't say his name in a shattered voice. She scanned her unconscious husband the way a doctor scans a wound that needs to be managed, then turned directly to Miles, who knew the schedule. The question fell like a blade. Miles answered briefly, without explanations. The people with authority to issue the route, a very small group. Harper nodded. She didn't ask why Silas was there. She didn't ask what had happened in the woods, as if every story was meaningless until she knew who had opened the door for the enemy. She glanced at Eli once, only once, but Eli felt as though she saw through the mud and torn clothes and straight into everything he'd had to survive. Get him inside. Call the family doctor. No sirens. No media. Harper turned toward a man standing half hidden in shadow, signaled with a small nod, and the house began to move like a disciplined body. No shouting, no chaos, only quick footsteps and doors opening at the right moments. Eli stayed where he was, stranded among clean-dressed people and cold walls. He knew he should disappear, because places like this weren't meant for him. He took one step backward toward the garage door, eyes already searching for an escape, when another woman appeared, tall, shoulders square, expression blank, a small earpiece in her ear like Miles's. She looked at Eli the way you look at an object that hasn't been cleared. "This child doesn't come with us," she said, voice flat. "He could be bait. He could have a tracking device. He could be how they lead us back here." Miles lifted a hand in front of Eli on instinct, a light shield, but Harper spoke first, still ice cold, and that made her even more frightening. "Your name," the woman answered at once. "Tessa Vaughn." Harper stepped closer, placing herself between Eli and Tessa like an invisible boundary. "Tessa, you have the right to be suspicious. You don't have the right to make a child afraid." Tessa's brow tightened. "You're protecting a risk." Harper didn't hold Tessa's gaze for long. She looked at Eli. "What's your name?" Eli lost a beat before he could speak. "Eli." Harper nodded, as if writing the name into a ledger inside her mind. "Eli, you saved my husband. You also just stepped into a war you don't belong to, and because you don't belong, you're easier to kill out there." Eli wanted to say he didn't need anyone to save him, that he'd survived on his own, but his throat closed. Tessa still wouldn't let go. What if he's the key they're using to open the door into this house? Harper turned to Tessa, and this time her eyes were as bright and hard as headlights in the dark. "Outside is the trap. If they wanted the boy gone, they'd do it the moment he stepped outside the gate. If they wanted to track us, they'd have been tracking us since the woods. You won't push him back out there and turn us into the ones who helped them finish burying him alive a second time." No one spoke for a beat. Eli could hear his own heart, and for the first time that night, he wasn't sure whether he was afraid of Harper or holding on to her. Harper signaled for a house staff member to bring warm water, clean towels, and an old pair of shoes that fit. She didn't perform pity. She simply acted as if it was what had to be done. Keep the boy in the room beside the living room. Don't lock it like a prison. But don't let him go alone. Tessa started to object, then looked at Miles, then looked at Harper's eyes, and finally only set her jaw, swallowing a sentence she didn't say. Miles lowered his voice to Harper as they moved down the hall. "I saw a third shoe print. Someone was watching." Harper didn't slow down, only gave a reply that sounded like it had been waiting. "Then we've got one more who needs to show their face." When Silas was placed on the bed in the inner room, the doctor checked him quickly. A small light sweeping across his pupils, fingers finding his pulse, everything done in secrecy, like a private truth. Eli stood at the threshold of the living room, a cup of water in his hands, eyes fixed on the hallway where Silas lay, feeling as if he were standing between two worlds. Then, from inside the room, a very soft sound rose, like a breath being pulled back. Harper turned instantly. Miles did too. The door eased open, and Silas, still weak, still pale, lifted his eyes, opening them just enough, sharp enough to cut through every doubt. That gaze found Eli the way it found an anchor. Silas didn't call his name. He didn't ask. He didn't thank him. He said only one sentence, rough and heavy as a verdict. "Stay where I can see you." The safe house settled back into a silence like a watch ticking inside a thick casing. Every sound swallowed the moment it touched the walls. Eli sat on the edge of the sofa, the water in his cup already cold, his legs still trembling, yet he forced his face into calm, as if that could make him feel less out of place. Harper stood lightly braced against the doorway that opened to the hall. One arm folded across her chest, the other hand holding her phone without pressing a thing, only waiting. Tessa stood slightly behind her, eyes never leaving Eli, as if she were recording every blink into an invisible report. Miles barely moved at all. Back straight, shoulders low, the stance of someone used to guarding a name that wasn't allowed to fall. From the inner room came the doctor's quiet voice. Then it stopped. A stretch of silence lasted just long enough for Eli to realize the most frightening thing here wasn't guns or bodyguards. It was absolute control. The door to Silas's room opened a hand's width, and very light but decisive footsteps sounded, as if a man had stepped out of a fever dream without losing an ounce of power. After the doctor administered an emergency IV, Silas Rourke appeared in the doorway. Though pale and leaning against the frame, his steel-gray gaze was as sharp as ever. He didn't ask who did it. He didn't slam a fist on the table. He didn't roar for the traitor. He only swept his eyes across them, slow enough that each person was forced to stand a little straighter, then stopped on Eli for one beat longer. Eli clenched the cup without meaning to, bracing for an accusation or a thank you. Neither came. Silas only turned to Miles. "Report." One word. Miles answered at once, clean and spare. "Silas is alive. The tracking device was removed clean. I saw a third shoe print at the edge of the pit. Someone watched, then pulled back. Silas nodded, as if confirming something he'd known before he even opened his eyes. "Tessa," he called. Tessa answered immediately, not daring to be slow. "Here." Silas looked at her, his tone unchanged. "Lock every internal channel. Anyone who contacts outside procedure, log it. No warnings. Just log it." Tessa swallowed once, but she still answered. "Understood." The whole room seemed to hold its breath at the same time, because everyone understood. This wasn't the anger of a man who'd just escaped death. This was the cold focus of a boss switching into hunting mode. Harper stepped forward one pace, level with Silas, her voice not shaking, not soft. "You need rest." Silas didn't look at her right away. He stared into the darkness beyond the window, where the trees were nothing but shadows. When he spoke again, his voice was rough but steady. "I rest when the person who flipped the switch to cut off rescue shows their face." Harper didn't argue with emotion. She went straight for what mattered. "We're talking about the truth, but you don't pull Eli into blood. Do you hear me?" Tessa's mouth twitched, like she wanted to say that was impossible in their world. But Harper didn't look at her. Harper looked at Silas. She didn't plead. She laid down a rule. Silas went quiet for a beat, long enough for Eli to think he'd give a thin smile or brush it aside. But then Silas turned back to Harper, his eyes not softer, only deeper, as if he were weighing a child's life on the same scale as his own honor. "I don't need blood," Silas said, each word dropping slow and heavy. "I need the truth." It wasn't a warm promise. It was a principle. It was frightening in a clean way, because it meant anyone standing between him and the truth would be crushed by things they couldn't fight. Money, records, evidence, loyalty stripped bare. Eli looked at Harper, then at Silas, and for the first time he understood why people only dared to say Silas's name in a whisper. Not because he shouted, because he made everyone else go quiet. Silas stepped farther into the living room, even though his legs still weren't fully steady, and he continued, as if issuing orders to the entire house. "No one talks to the press. No one uses personal phones. No one goes outside alone. If anyone asks, Silas Rourke hasn't come back." Miles nodded immediately, already used to this kind of vanish and regroup tactic. Harper only watched him, as if she needed to be sure he wasn't trading her morality for a win. Silas looked at Eli again, this time more directly. "Stay." One word, short, leaving no room for argument. Eli opened his mouth to ask why, but nothing came out, because in Silas's eyes there was something strange. Not pity, not tenderness, but recognition. As if Eli had just become part of a story Silas wouldn't allow to end wrong. Tessa turned to a wall-mounted screen, her voice still cold. "I pulled the gate camera data from last night." She tapped a few commands. A blurred image appeared, the time in the corner running in numbers, but she read it out loud in words. Close to midnight. On the screen, a vehicle stopped at the edge of the light, and a figure stepped out, the posture familiar enough that Miles tilted his head slightly. The person didn't hurry. The person walked as if checking territory that belonged to him. When the face tipped into the light, Harper didn't blink, but her hand tightened. Silas's expression didn't change either, only his eyes darkened like a storm rolling in. Tessa said the name like a hammer landing on the exact crack. Grant Harlow, the right hand, the most trusted man, the one who'd appeared near the safe house area just before the ambush. Silas said nothing for a long, drawn beat, and that silence made the entire room truly mute, as if everyone had just understood that the hunt now had a shape, a name, and the price of betrayal wouldn't be paid in blood spraying everywhere. But in the moment, the traitor realized the boss was looking straight at him, and there was no road back. Eli was taken into a small bathroom so clean it made him feel dirty in a way he couldn't hide. White tile without a single stain. Towels folded into perfect squares like the ones he'd only ever seen through hotel glass. A house staff member set a new set of clothes on the sink and stepped back out. No questions, no staring. As if Harper had made a rule in advance that no one was allowed to make him feel ashamed. Eli stood in front of the mirror and watched his face emerge as the mud rinsed away. Hollow cheeks. Dark circles from too many nights without sleep. A small scrape on his wrist. He ran water over his hair, listening to his own heart pound as if it was waiting for a slap from this polished world. But it didn't come. There was only silence, and the strange, rich scent of soap. When he stepped out, the new clothes fit. The shoes weren't torn, His stomach was filled with a bowl of hot soup, and he ate more slowly than he normally would, because he was afraid, if he ate too fast, someone would snatch it away. He still didn't believe it. He'd lived long enough on the street to know that kindness usually had a price, and that price was usually collected when you were at your weakest. Tessa didn't stay far from him, a watchful shadow, while Harper passed by now and then, not saying much, only observing as if she were calculating something larger than him. Silas didn't appear in the living room again, but his presence lived in every footstep Miles took, in the way everyone automatically lowered their voices, in the way Tessa lifted her phone and set it back down as if she was afraid of shaking an invisible wire. Eli finished eating, wiped his mouth, set the bowl down very gently, and decided that if he didn't ask now, he never would. He got up and walked down the hallway to the inner room door, where yellow light spilled out thin as a warning. Miles stood there, but when Eli stopped, Miles didn't block him. He only looked at him for a second and shifted aside, as if to say there were questions that had to be asked, even when everyone was afraid of the answers. Eli went in. Silas sat on the edge of the bed. His shirt had been changed. His wrist was lightly bandaged, but the way he held himself still looked like a man sitting on a throne. He watched Eli come closer without moving, eyes unblinking, not annoyed, only waiting. Eli felt his throat go dry, but he forced himself not to step back. "You owe me an answer," he said, his voice small but not breaking. "Why didn't anyone come?" The air in the room seemed to freeze. That question wasn't just curiosity from a child. It was an accusation aimed at the very power Silas represented, the power that made people believe he couldn't be touched. Silas held Eli's gaze for one beat longer, then let out a slow breath, as if each breath was measured. He didn't retell what happened in the woods. He didn't explain the protection chain. He said only one sentence, short and so cold it made Eli shiver. "Because someone wanted me dead. Not someone wanted to steal. Not an accident. Wanted dead. On purpose." Eli opened his mouth to ask who, but Silas lifted his eyes, and in that look was a reminder that names here were guns, and guns weren't meant to be put in a child's hands. Harper stepped in then, as if she'd heard everything from the doorway. She didn't scold Eli for daring to ask. She looked at Silas, then at Eli, and spoke in a calm voice, as if she were restoring order to a room that had just been hit by wind. "Eli, come with me." She led him out, into a small room beside the living room, a single bed and a dresser. A new blanket lay on the bed, so soft Eli didn't dare touch it right away. Harper set an old cloth bag on the bedside table, the color faded, smelling of shelters and damp paper. "These are your things," she said. "We got them back from where they took you tonight." Eli stared at the bag like he was staring at a piece of his life that had been picked up from a ditch. He reached in and touched things that were worthless to anyone else. A comb with broken teeth, a lighter with no fuel, a photograph with the corners worn pale, and then his fingers found a crumpled envelope, the edge crushed and wrinkled as if it had been picked up and put down dozens of times. Eli pulled it out halfway, then his hand stopped. He didn't open it. He'd meant to, many times, but every time he was afraid whatever was inside would shatter the last thing he still held, the belief that his mother had left without abandoning him. Harper saw the hesitation. She didn't ask what the envelope was. She only gently took it from Eli's hand, the way you take a knife that's turned back toward the person holding it. "You don't have to open it yet," she said, not too soft, but warm enough. "Some things need the right moment." Then she placed the envelope into a dresser drawer and locked it, not to hide it from Eli, but to protect him from his own fear. Eli stood still, chest heavy as stone, yet inside him a thin, new thread of something like safety began to form. Harper turned toward the door. At the far end of the hallway, Miles murmured something to her. Harper listened, and her expression shifted just slightly, like someone maintaining calm who had just felt a line get yanked. She moved quickly toward the living room. Tessa stood at the table with a white envelope in her hand. No stamp, no postmark, as if it had appeared inside the house on its own. Tessa set it down, opened it, and slid out a photograph. The room fell into silence when Harper saw it. In the picture was Eli in the woods, the moment he turned his head under the light, mud still on his face, fear filling his eyes, and around the photo a rough red circle had been drawn, like a target. Beneath it, a single line printed in bold, cold as an order. "Give the kid back." The unmarked envelope lay on the table like a stone set in the middle of still water. It didn't have to be big to make ripples. Harper didn't ask who delivered it. because that kind of question belonged to people who still believed locked doors and cameras were magic. She only looked at Silas. He stood in the living room doorway, his expression unchanged, but his eyes darkened like rain rolling in. Tessa spoke quickly, her voice flat, saying there were no signs of a break-in, no image of a courier, no unfamiliar vehicle entering the gate. Miles repeated one observation that made the air turn colder. If the envelope got in, it meant someone inside the network opened a path, or someone knew this place down to its very breath. Eli wasn't in the living room anymore. Harper had taken him back to his room, but his presence still hung there like a taut thread, because that photograph made it clear the enemy didn't just want Silas erased. They wanted the small witness who had seen. Silas didn't say a word about the photograph. He didn't slam a fist down. He didn't swear. He turned to Tessa, his voice low but final. "Lock the channels," Tessa answered immediately. "It was already done." Silas nodded. "Open exactly one channel, the channel people trust the most." Tessa hesitated. In this world, some channels were a backbone. Touching them meant declaring war on your own organization. Harper looked at Silas and understood he was about to do something dangerous, in the quietest way. "Are you sure?" Silas didn't answer her question. He asked another one instead, like placing a piece on the board. "Of the people still allowed to call me directly, who called last night?" Tessa flicked her eyes to the screen. "Grant called. You didn't pick up." Silas nodded again, as if confirming what he'd smelled the moment he woke. "Good." He turned away and walked into the small office in the back, the room with screens and a safe, where everything was so clean it felt threatening. Harper followed. Miles stood outside the door like a wall. Silas opened the safe and took out a thin file, not thick, yet heavy enough to kill a man without laying a hand on him. He set it on the desk, pulled a blank sheet of paper, wrote a few lines, then handed it to Tessa. "This information goes through one channel only. Say it like it slipped out. Say it like I'm desperate. Say it like I'm leaving the safe house near dawn, taking the old route to meet a contact, because I need to move before the police catch the scent." Tessa read, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This is bait." "This is a measuring stick," Silas corrected. "Bait only needs someone to bite. A measuring stick tells you who bleeds." Harper felt cold along her spine, because it meant Silas had chosen a trap designed not to make the enemy bleed, but to force the man inside his own house to show his face. And the man inside was what killed fastest. Silas didn't send a text. He didn't make a call. He only signaled. And Tessa turned his words into a small scrap of information that drifted through the internal channel like a half-finished sentence. No signature. No confirmation. Only enough for whoever was waiting to believe Silas had panicked. Harper watched the organization move, and for the first time she saw it clearly. Silas's power wasn't in guns. It was in the way he could make an entire system shift with a single sentence. They waited. Not long, only a short stretch, just long enough that Eli in his room heard nothing but silence and thought he'd been forgotten. When the small light on Tessa's screen blinked, Silas stepped closer, eyes unblinking. "Who asked again?" Tessa looked, and her face went slightly pale in a way that was hard to notice on features trained to stay cold. "Not anyone new. Someone old." "Name," Silas said. One word, like a firing order. Tessa swallowed. "Ronan Pike." The name dropped into the room like a piece of metal. Ronan wasn't a low-level man. Ronan was someone who'd followed Silas from the beginning, someone who'd stood watch through rain-soaked nights without a warm coat, someone who'd sworn on a family ring he would never sell out. Harper looked at Silas, waiting for a reaction, but Silas only stared at the air in front of him, as if reading invisible text. "Bring him in," he said. No noise. No hands. Tessa nodded, her eyes flashing with irritation because she understood. With a trusted man, this would be the deepest cut. Ronan was brought into the office not long after. He looked terrifyingly normal. Neat coat, combed hair. No sign of fear. Like a man who believed he was still standing in the right place. When the door closed, Miles stayed outside. Harper was inside with Silas. Tessa stood in the corner like a living camera. Silas didn't ask, "Why did you do it?" He asked something else, so light Ronan almost smiled. "Do you know I was just buried alive?" Ronan stalled for a beat. "I heard. Then you also know a child pulled me out of that pit," Silas continued, and this time his eyes sharpened. "And you still asked what route I'd take." Ronan swallowed. I only wanted to protect you. Silas nodded as if agreeing, then pushed the thin file across the desk toward Ronan. Then protect me. Look. Ronan opened it, and his expression changed like a man whose clothes had been stripped off in cold wind. It wasn't blood. It wasn't violence. It was numbers. Split transfers. Intermediate accounts. A chain of transactions, holding hands like footprints. And at the end of those footprints, Ronan's name appeared again and again. Steady, clean, too consistent to be an accident. Silas didn't raise his voice. I don't need to hit you. I only need to hand this to Holt. Or to my auditor. You won't just lose your freedom. You'll lose the name Loyal you've been living on. Ronan trembled. Boss, Silas cut him off with one final question. A question that closed the door. Who ordered it cleaned? Ronan went silent, his eyes reddening, and then he finally bowed his head, like a man forced to choose between two deaths. Cyrus, he said, his voice breaking. Cyrus Rourke said, if you disappear